can see our special guest is with us already. And I'm not sure if all of you are familiar. I believe so, because Dr. Vladimira Silva has been before with us already a few times, and it's always great to have you here. Dr. Vladimira, how are you feeling? And it's great to have you back as our speaker, for sure.
Hi, Caroline. It's always a pleasure to participate in your events. Thanks for having me. I will try not to be boring, and it's always a pleasure to be able to talk to you and our patients about legislation and multiple technical subjects.
Of course, as I've mentioned, there are some webinars that we've done in the past, and I know that patients definitely love how you explain everything. And our topic tonight is about IVF legislation in Portugal. So, of course, Dr. Vladimira will tell you all about this. And let me just mention that Dr. Vladimira is the CEO, founder, and IVF lab director at Ferticentro. There are two locations, Coimbra, and the other one is, remind me, where is
in Porto? It's the clinic called Procrear.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah, sorry, but yeah. So he will be happy to tell you all about the regulations. So I guess we can start with the presentation then. Yes.
Okay, perfect. I will share my screen then.
Go ahead. Okay. And just remember, everyone, that after the presentation, it will be time for your questions. As always, just put those in the chat section, and Dr. Vladimira will definitely answer them for you. So don't hesitate. And yeah, let's go ahead with the presentation then.
Okay. Are you already seeing my presentation?
I can see it clearly, so all is good. Thanks.
Okay, perfect. So, hi everybody. Like Caroline was saying, my name is Vladimir Silva. I'm the CEO and IVF lab director at Ferticentro, also at Procrear. Ferticentro and Procrear are both clinics in Portugal. Ferticentro is in Coimbra, Procrear is in Porto. I'm here to talk about the IVF legislation in Portugal. Because first of all, because the European Fertility Society invited me, and also because it's a pleasure for us to talk about the IVF legislation in our country. Because in fact, Portugal has a very special IVF legislation that creates what I call, what I consider to be a perfect environment, either from a technical point of view, but also from an ethical, patient's rights and donors' rights point of view. And so this is what I will briefly talk to you about. At the end, if you want, we can discuss more detailed questions and talk a little bit about the system, the European system, our opinion on that, and so on. So also, this is a picture of Coimbra, our hometown. And so what I would like to say is this. I think this kind of progressive IVF legislation is what will be the new normal. I think in 10 years from now, all countries will have laws that are certainly closer to the current Portuguese legislation, and in the future, when we hear to talk about things like anonymous donors and treatments that are forbidden in certain locations, it will be something from the past that makes absolutely no sense for future generations. But the present is here, and so let's talk a little bit about the Portuguese legislation so you can understand how it works. So, like I was saying, it all starts with ethics, and it's very important that we respect the ethics of the whole process, because patients are here because they want to have babies, they want to form their families. So it's a beautiful dream, it's a very nice process, it's obviously a good moment in life. It's naturally when patients go to an IVF clinic, unless they are lesbian or single women, where they always require an IVF clinic to fulfill their dreams. But heterosexual couples have probably already tried naturally, or at least the vast majority of them, or they've already been diagnosed with some kind of disease. So, but again, it's very important, but everybody who starts IVF has the hope and believes that it will work. They want to have a kid, they want to have a baby, they are willing to do sacrifices to build their families and move on with their lives. So it is very important that we move to this next step of our lives with a good start. So you don't want to start things the wrong way because at some moment in time someone was not treated correctly. So it is important that we start to talk about ethics. First of all, the ethics of accessibility. In Portugal, treatment can be done to heterosexual couples, like everywhere else in the world. Lesbian couples, not all countries allow that. Single women, also not all countries allow that. For example, last week France authorized the access to lesbian couples and single women. Unfortunately, gay men are still not authorized to have IVF treatment in Portugal. So there are still some groups of persons who are left outside the law, but still this is, I believe, as good as it gets in Europe. And so it's already not bad, but there is still a little way to go to complete the circle. Of course, marriage is not a requirement to access treatments, because in the real world, you don't need to get married to have a baby if you're not infertile. So there is obviously no reason why in the medical world we need people to be married in order to access the treatment that they need in order to have kids. So ethics is also about non-discrimination. We cannot discriminate someone because they have a certain sexual option, sexual orientation, or because they're married or not. There are still countries, for example, in some of the most famous countries in Europe, for IVF treatments, marriage is still a requirement. For example, for lesbian patients to do the RUPA method, some countries still require that they have to be married, which makes absolutely no sense from a social and ethical point of view. And so the other important factor in the Portuguese legislation is that families are protected. In Portugal, there is a very strong regulatory environment. We have an IVF authority, which is called the CNPMA. CNPMA stands for Conselho Nacional de Procriação Medicamente Assistida, and for those of you who don't understand Portuguese, which probably are the majority, this means something like National Council for Assisted Reproductive Technology. This IVF authority is the equivalent of the British HFEA or the French Agence de la Biomédecine and many other authorities across Europe. This is an authority that monitors, inspects closely, and sets the rules for IVF centers to work with. And also, on top of that, they also establish quality standards. There is a list of requirements, very demanding requirements, that all IVF centers have to comply with in order to be licensed and be able to work as an IVF center. So it is incredibly detailed, and it is followed up very closely. In Portugal, we also have a system which is particularly interesting because IVF cycles are registered online and in real time. So when we start an IVF cycle, we register it in a web-based database from the National IVF Authority. Obviously, the identity of the patients is protected. We only register codes the key to those codes is only in our system, but this is a way so the IVF authority knows exactly what clinics are doing what. And then when we get inspections, they are able to see whether things were registered properly. Okay, this is particularly important in donation treatments. I will talk a little bit about that later, but this gives a lot of assurance to the patients, and so they know that it is virtually not possible that the clinic could be working outside the regulations and very strict and demanding quality standards that have been set by the Portuguese IVF authority. For example, quality management systems are legally required in Portugal for more than 10 years now. So all IVF clinics have to be ISO certified, otherwise they can't even work in the IVF field, and it's the same for public and private clinics. The IVF authority also grants access to transparent medical information. They make sure that that information is kept for 75 years, which means that in terms of traceability, should something happen later in the life of a child born from IVF, the baseline information from the treatment where that person was born is still available for most of the life of that person. That's obviously particularly important in donation treatments case, because the donor's ID and the traceability for the donors is also assured for 75 years, for at least 75 years. What does it mean? For example, if someone does a treatment with a sperm donor, and later someone else does that treatment. For example, let's say a patient, she gets pregnant with sperm donor 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then another patient also gets pregnant from the same donor. If the first patient reports that an health condition was identified in her son, for example, at the age of 2 or 3 years, they end up diagnosing a genetic disorder or something like that, the second patient is immediately informed that that happened with that donor. How can that be possible? First of all, because we are legally required to notify the Portuguese IVF authority, and then all patients in Europe that have been treated with those straws, or countries to where those straws were distributed, their local IVF authorities are immediately notified. So all families that received cells from this donor are immediately informed, and that there could be a risk that their baby is a carrier of some defective gene and so on. This is very important because those kinds of things are extremely rare. They don't happen to donors because they are donors. They happen to donors because they are persons. All human beings are at the same theoretical risk for having some rare genetic disease. The difference with donations is that there is a system in place that assures full traceability for those 75 years. And so all families are informed in real time, and in Portugal that works particularly well, also because we have a law where donors are not anonymous, and so even the culture of the donor is oriented to that. So obviously traceability is also possible to do with anonymous donors, but with non-anonymous donors, the donor is someone who knows that his identity will be revealed. And so he is also someone more involved in making sure that the family to whom he donated will be happy with the process. So that's also an advantage of the Portuguese system, something that doesn't happen when we're dealing, for example, with anonymous donors. And also the other way around. So it's not only about families and also about donors, because donors' rights in Portugal are protected. All donors receive proper counseling before and after donating. They have to agree, for example, with non-anonymity. They have to comply, to be able to comply, to cope with the fact that they have donated. They have to be in peace with the process and with the possibility that in the future someone might contact them and say, I'm your biological son, which is normal, okay, and it's something that will most inevitably happen. In Portugal, donors are paid. They receive financial compensation that is transparent and it's fixed by law, and it is obviously destinated to compensate the donor for the time and loss of income that they receive during the process. It's fixed in 878 euros per egg donation, 44 euros per sperm collection. It's the same for all public and private IVF centers. Payments can only be done by bank transfer. We cannot pay in cash. Donors have to sign a receipt, and we have to keep a proof of payment. Okay, so again, it is a completely transparent process. There is no money under the table, and everyone knows how much donors are getting, and there's no auction between clinics to seduce donors, and there is no abusive increase in the money paid to different donors, because it's the state that defines how much donors receive for every donation. An egg donor can only donate 4 times in her lifetime. Those donations have to be separated by at least 3 months. And this is actually controlled in real time, okay? Because there are other countries with limits on donations, but then there is no control, which makes possible for donors to donate 3 times or 4 times or 6 times in a clinic. Then the clinics next door, on the clinic next door, another 6 times, or in the clinic in another state another 6 times, and so on. In Portugal, it is absolutely impossible that happens, because before starting, for example, an egg donation cycle, we have to log in the web platform of the PMA, the Portuguese IVF Authority. We have to introduce the donor's national ID code if the donor is Portuguese, or the passport number if the donor is not Portuguese, and check for eligibility. So then, if the donor has donated, say, 4 times elsewhere, we will get a message saying this donor cannot donate again. Okay, and so if she is available to donate, we will get a donation code, and that code will assure the traceability of that to that donor. So from the moment we get a donation code, that code will connect the results of the treatment with the ID of the donor. That will be particularly important if the child born from the donation wants to have access to the ID of the donor. Maybe 18 years later, maybe 20, 40, 50 years later, it's up to the person to decide. But so if the clinic where the treatment was held doesn't even exist anymore, that information will always be available by the Portuguese state. So it's an obligation of the Portuguese state and a guarantee from the Portuguese state that the access to the ID of the donor will always be granted. And this is why this donation code is so important. But anyway, even with just the name and the ID of the parents of the child, it is possible to get to the donation code. So, regarding sperm donors, they can donate to 8 families. And again, this is also controlled. We have to report it online. And on top of that, we are obviously inspected. And clinics have to prove that what they are doing is actually being registered in the database of the National IVF Authority. And also from a donor's perspective, donors don't have surprise. Because sometimes, like I've written in this slide, donors and families, right, they merge. So at the age of 18, if a child born from IVF wants to access the ID of their donor, They don't want to meet someone who doesn't expect or doesn't want to be found. They want to know or to get the name of someone who already knew that this could happen, that was happy with that possibility, that is available to meet that person, that is willing to know that. We don't want to knock on the door of a donor and then he will be like, what, how on earth was this possible, how did they found me, I did this to help someone and now someone is bothering me. No, it is the donor knows that he or she can be contacted in the future, and he is sort of expecting that. A lot of our donors say, I do hope children get in touch with me. It would be really interesting. And so, and obviously donors made those decisions after receiving proper counseling. It will never happen the other way around. So donors don't have any rights over the children that are born. They cannot take the initiative to contact the children, but they can. But so it's always this is a right of the child born from the IVF treatment, not the right of the donor, and it's also not a right of the children's parents, and any possible contact will always be the initiative of the children, never on the initiative of the donor. Okay, but again, donors are know that they can happen. It will not be a surprise. Okay, it's something with which they are completely in peace. We're also a country that is known for like I said, unless for gay men, but for the LGBTQ plus community, we are a very friendly country, especially for lesbian couples, because we even have this website. It's called Bride Babies. It's a new ongoing project where we will share. We are already sharing information, testimonials. It's sort of a survival guide for women's couples that are willing to have a child, where we can not just women's couples but other persons couples, so we can explain what can and can't be done, because nowadays we have also transgender patients and so on. And so the Portuguese legislation has solutions for most of those cases. I will not talk about this in detail, but there are solutions for all of those cases. We are still preparing a lot of information that we will be putting online about on this project. We have former and current patients that are helping us in this process. It is already very interesting. We will be doing a lot of webinars and initiatives, so wait for it in the upcoming months, because there is a lot of things coming on. And bottom line, what we want to say is that we have a very inclusive legislation. In the case of lesbian families, both elements of the couple have exactly the same rights over the embryos created and children that are born. Because in some countries, first of all, like I said in the beginning, marriage is not allowed. Is not required. Sorry, it is allowed. And in some countries, when a lesbian couple splits and there are still embryos, the embryos belong to the person who donated the eggs, and the other person is left without nothing. Here it is truly a shared project. So they both have exactly the same rights over the embryos. If a lesbian couple splits and there are still embryos, one of them, even if it was with her eggs and the sperm donor, she cannot use their embryos, because they also belong to her former wife or girlfriend or partner. Okay, so regardless of who donates the egg or who carries the pregnancy, because we're also talking about reciprocal IVF or the ROPA method or shared motherhood. There are multiple designations. This is where a lady carries her wife, carries a pregnancy that was obtained with her wife or her girlfriend's egg and the sperm donor. like I was saying, the embryos always belong to both elements of the couple who have exactly the same rights over them. So marriage is not required, and the other woman, the one who is not carrying the baby, has exactly the same rights over either the embryos or the children. The rights over the children are a different issue because they depend on the country where patients deliver. Obviously, if they deliver in Portugal, they are both the legal mothers of that child. If they deliver in France or the UK or Poland or wherever, then it's local regulations that apply. But regarding the ownership of the embryos, which is the only factor that we can control, they have exactly the same rights. And also, one very important thing here is that since donors, sperm donors in this case, are not anonymous, obviously it could be a double donation as well, but since donors are not anonymous, there is not a mysterious third person where sometimes that sometimes can introduce a little confusion in family relationships. So children born from lesbian couples, they obviously know that they were born from a sperm donor, maybe even also an egg donor. They know, but they are in peace with the process because they know that his identity will be revealed to them in the future should they want that information. It is not legally required. They will not receive a letter stating your donor is Mr. X. No, it's just something that if they want to know, they have the right of access to that information. So one of the questions that we often get from our patients is how does the non-anonymous donor system works, and especially how can Portugal, which is often seen as a very Catholic and traditional country, have such a progressive legislation? Well, it actually happened by accident. I've already told this story here in previous communications, but initially, and I don't want to bother you with telling this all over again, but in Portugal, we had a surrogacy law that was approved. It was a very strict law. Surrogacy has nothing to do with this subject, okay? But a group of conservative members of the parliament, they placed a plaintiff on the Constitutional Court, which is the highest court in the country, against surrogacy. And when you are complaining to the Constitutional Court about the law, you have to indicate what points of the law are wrong. And so they listed a series of points in the Portuguese IVF law. And so the Constitutional Court, the Constitutional Court made a very original and curious decision. They said that surrogacy was actually possible in Portugal because it wasn't against the Portuguese legislation. However, the law had to be rebuilt. And so they eliminated all the points from the law that were on that request. However, and that was later assumed by those members of the parliament, they have accidentally added the anonymity points to the list of points that should be eliminated. And so, by an absolute accident, from one day to the other, we lost all donors because donors were anonymous. And then, with this decision, and it was a last appeal court, there is no appeal from the Constitutional Court decision, donors become only non-anonymous. And so, and that those decisions from the Constitutional Court have immediate effect. So it was literally from one day to the other. And treatments that were supposed to be done the next day had to be cancelled because those donors have signed a document where they were supposed to be anonymous. So what have we done? We started working, okay? In the first 2 weeks after that ruling from the Constitutional Court, we have called more than 600 persons, and we had the most pleasant surprise. I did a lot of calls myself, and it was incredible how generous people were. So 97% of our registered egg donors accepted to be non-anonymous. We're even talking about people who had already donated in the past and just signed the document so that the children born from their donation could later have access to their identity. So they have they had already concluded the process. They did it anonymously, and still they agreed to sign the document just to help the families that they were to whom they had donated. 70% of our sperm donors also accepted to become non-anonymous. And again, we're talking about people who had donated years ago, who had received the financial compensation, who are not in touch with us for like 2 or 3 years, and still they agreed to come to the clinic and sign the document, and thus living the anonymity. And so obviously we also started a lot of campaigns. There were public hospitals doing campaigns to get new donors, and also official bodies like the Portuguese Society for Reproductive Science, for Reproductive Medicine, patients associations like the Portuguese Fertility Association. All private IVF centers have their own campaigns, obviously, and there was a lot of debate going on the Portuguese society, and it was who would have guessed, but donations peaked. We've never had this many donors as we had after we removed anonymity from the law. So it was actually a very good surprise, because it proves that people who are donating, they are truly altruistic. They are submitting themselves, well, in the case of egg donors, to an invasive and sometimes relatively aggressive process just to help other persons. And when they were when they were facing the possibility of staying at home, doing nothing, still being anonymous, they agreed to come to they almost all agreed to come to the clinic, sign the document, and help those people to whom they have previously donated. So currently there's no shortage of gametes in private centers. We've even established the first private egg and sperm bank in Portugal. Now there are other clinics doing that. And so things are going well, even with this COVID situation where donations were put on hold for a few months. We still don't have any problem recruiting new donors, and thanks to the generosity of all of those young ladies and young men, we've been able to help thousands of patients from all countries, from all continents, and especially European countries. Well, one of the things that sometimes one of the questions that I get a lot is, what's the point? Why do we need known donors? What are they for? Well, first of all, it is a question of right, because getting to know your origins is every person's right, and it's also something that you cannot help nowadays, but certainly not in the future. For example, if you go online, there are currently DNA banks everywhere in the world that are collecting DNA from multiple persons. You can order a DNA kit. You can order a DNA kit from home. It will cost you maybe less than 100 euros. It's actually here, it's 99 euros. And then you can send your DNA to a bank, and the response that you will get is something like, you are 20% African, 10% Nordic, wherever, and we have here 27 cousins and 3 half brothers and sisters. Okay, so do you want to meet them or not? And obviously you get curious, and because you want to know your ancestry, you want to understand where do you come from, where do your family comes from, and based on those DNA banks, it takes sometimes just an afternoon to identify who your so-called anonymous donor was. For example, in France, there is an association which is called PMA non-anonym, which means non-anonymous non-anonymous IVF, that thanks to those DNA tests, for example, this print screen is from last year, they were already able to identify 186 parents from the identity of the donors for 186 persons. Okay, and that number is still growing and still counting. It's very simple. You just send your DNA to those banks, and with the technology that's already available nowadays, it's relatively easy to identify a donor. Even if the donor himself has never sent his DNA to one of these banks, it's enough sometimes that 2 or 3 of his cousins have done it, and the information is relatively easy to triangulate and identify who the donor is. And so someone who had donated under anonymity, thinking that he would stay anonymous and move on with his life forever, will be now it's already possible to identify him. And at the same time, because sometimes in countries where people have done treatment without any control on the number of donations, you might end up knowing that you have 20 half brothers and half sisters, or maybe more, throughout the world. Okay, this is something that has been object of a debate in the scientific community. For example, in this article published in Human Reproduction, which is actually, this was published more than 5 years ago in one of the main scientific publications in Europe, they were saying that genetic testing is likely to drive anonymous genetic donation out of business, because in fact the reality is that there's no such thing as an anonymous donor. With this reality of DNA banks, it's absolutely impossible to make sure that the donor is and will always be anonymous. So it's helpless. Donors are probably are either non-anonymous from the beginning and well counseled, completely and in complete agreement with that status, or they will be found against their will. It is already possible today. It will certainly become easier in the future with the fast development of genetic technologies. Take this example. This is also an information that I collected from the website PMA Non-Anonym. You will see that some of these banks have in their database 15 million people, 10 million people, 2.5 million people. This is really huge. So you will see that on this graphic alone, and this data comes from August 2019, these banks alone had DNA from, roughly speaking, 30 million people. That's 3 times the Portuguese population. And for example, another information from another of this website, they have 95 million users, 3.9 billion family trees, 12.4 billion historical records. So there is really no such thing as an anonymous donor. And obviously, we've all seen in the press the stupid stories like this one. For example, this guy from the Netherlands, when this information was published, he already had 106 kids and probably a lot more on the way. Because he was just donating sperm everywhere. And since there is no control in some countries, not between clinics, not at the national level at least, he was having kids everywhere. And obviously, when these kids that are born from supposedly anonymous donors, one day that information will come to them eventually. So it's way more preferable to do it in a controlled way instead of moving into the jungle of anonymous donation. Also, is a question, like I was saying, of this is something that have been worrying humanity since forever. For example, there are other ways to find the truth. For example, this very interesting study, this is just out of curiosity, based on the study of the Y chromosome, geneticists from the University of Leicester in England, they have found that millions of men living currently in Asian countries, they are actually descended from 11 very powerful dynastic leaders, like, for example, the most known of them, the Mongolian warlord Genghis Khan. So there are multiple ways. We can also use mitochondrial DNA studies, which is something that goes from your mother, who has received it from your grandmother, and so on. And so based on it's a part of the DNA that's only passed to us by our mothers, because it comes from the egg. And still, based on those studies, you can identify where do your family comes from, and so on. And again, based on that, it's relatively easy to identify donors. There are countries, for example, like the USA and Canada, and the Netherlands as well, where there are even services of donor detectives. So people are paying these companies to find the identity of their supposedly anonymous sperm donors. So these services are being offered online. So there is really no way to end this, because this is essentially a question of human rights. There is also this declaration from the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, where they say that international and European human rights law has moved towards the recognitions of a right to know one's origins. And so obviously they can't make laws, it's up to every country to define their own rules, but they have a recommendation that anonymity should be waived for all future gamete donations. Okay, so obviously anonymity shouldn't be lifted retrospectively, unless obviously donors want to lift that, as it happened in Portugal. But essentially it is a very important question of human rights, and that's something that we cannot deny the future generations. Obviously, no one starts an IVF treatment everyone who wants to have a kid prefers to have it with their own cells. But if for some reason it is necessary to use a donor, that donor, the DNA for that donor is part of the identity of their children. And it's okay. Children deal very well with that kind of information. And so this is how it is so important that we are transparent, that our children don't find out those things accidentally, and also, not especially, but also that the donors that have helped us to build our families are not confronted with, in an unexpected way, with someone knocking on their door without them even imagining that that could be possible. That's more or less what I was just saying. And so one of and so coming again to the topic of this presentation, this is actually why the Portuguese system is the best solution, and I believe it will be the standard regulation in 10 or 15 years maybe, because it is a very ethical system where donors and families have their mutual rights respected, where families have control about the moment on how and when and if the information is disclosed, because ultimately this is always a private right. It's something that it's a decision to reveal or not, or not the existence of a donor is a very private decision that belongs to every family. It's like a door that is closed and can or cannot be opened by the person which is more affected by it, the children born from the donation. In Portugal, with this environment, with the fact that we don't have any shortage of donors, we don't have waiting lists, and that has allowed us to keep our treatments affordable. We are it is actually we are normally cheaper than those countries where donors are still anonymous, and so it's sort of a win-win combination. And so here's a picture of our team at Ferticentro. There are a few people missing there, and also we've just moved to our new facilities. We have opened the new clinic this month, and there are here a few pictures of our new waiting room and the outside of the clinic. So please feel free to call or write to us. I'm very happy to talk to you if you have any questions. And so I'm available. Caroline, I don't know if you're still there talking to me. I will stop sharing my screen.
Of course, I'm here.
Yeah.
And trust me, it's always nice to listen to you because it's definitely interesting. And I always love how you explain things, how you provide some stories behind those legislation as well. So it's always amazing. So thanks so much. It's always a great pleasure to have you as our presenter for sure. And I've seen many times, many comments from patients that also they agree with me. So yeah, now it is time for our Q&A session. As you can see, there are some questions already. But if you have some more questions, of course, now it is time to do it. Go ahead and let's have a look. Okay, the first question we've got from Angela, and this is in regards to your presentation, of course, as well. Yeah. So how do you control the maximum amount a donor can donate, and he goes to another country to donate?
It's impossible. Okay, we can only control it on a national level. Obviously, I think the ideal would be to have this controlled at the European level. For example, there are currently sperm banks in Denmark. I mean, everybody knows Cryos and the European Sperm Bank and so on. They have their own national quotas, and obviously they know how many straws and pregnancies they're getting from different countries, but that's different from having so what I want to say is this: we can have banks working on an international level, but the only way to control this is by having sort of a supervising authority controlling for everything, because otherwise, I mean, in cryos, for example, they control how many pregnancies they're getting from their donors, but they don't know if their donor is donating also in Germany, for instance, or somewhere else. There is no way to control if someone has donated in another country. But in Portugal, we know we know when national quotas have been reached.
Thanks so much, of course, for the very first question, Angela, and as always, Vladimir, for answering it thoroughly. And the next question, also from Angela: why are sperm donors allowed to donate 8 times and an egg donor only 4 times?
That's an easy one, because, well, first of all, sperm donors are not allowed to donate 8 times. They are allowed to donate to 8 families. Okay, and it's very the process is way more different. Okay, when a lady donates her eggs, she has to undergo an ovarian stimulation. She has to be submitted to an invasive procedure under general anesthesia. We have to collect the eggs, and so and she has to her ovaries have to be stimulated. And obviously, we cannot exaggerate on that. We cannot compromise the fertility of the donor. We cannot put her health on risk. Okay, so 4 times is an acceptable number of ovarian stimulations. There are multiple reassuring studies not associating this with any risks, either for the fertility or the health of the donor, but more than 4 times is certainly too much. Okay, so the limit is more about protecting the health of the egg donor, and then the risk of consanguinity. Obviously, collecting sperm is very easy. It's not an invasive procedure. There is so it's something that can be done very easily, and also from just one sperm collections we can have multiple straws, and so it's a lot easier to get many straws from a sperm donor. And so I would say that the limits on sperm usage are more about the risk of consanguinity, and 8 families seems like a sensible limit. In the UK, it is 10 families. In other countries, it is a little more. So generally speaking, countries apply normal limits. The problem is not about setting up the limits, because the limits typically are wise. I don't know any case where any country where the limits don't make sense, or at least are unacceptable. The problem is with controlling the process, because if you put a limit on 8 families and then you don't control it, or you don't control how many times the neck donor donates, or you cannot have a national authority controlling it, that it's hopeless. It's worth nothing. And so it's like not having any limit at all. So this is so answering Angela here, it's about protecting the health of the egg donor. In the case of the egg donor, it's about the risk of consanguinity in the case of sperm donors.
Wonderful. Thank you so much indeed. It's an interesting question as well. Maybe, as you answered this, it does seem like it's an easy answer and it makes sense for sure, but it's interesting. Thanks so much for that as well. Okay. Right now, there's another question also from Angela, and might be our final one. So if you have any left, this will be the final call for them. So go ahead, type those in, and let's have a look. This is the question. What happens if there's an odd number of embryos, example 1, 3, or 5? When a couple divorces, splits up, who gets the extra one?
Actually, no one gets the extra one. The embryos belong to a couple. Okay, so the embryos are either so you can only use those embryos as a couple. Either it is a women's couple or an heterosexual couple. Okay, so in Portugal, it is not possible to, if we have 4 embryos, to give to in a lesbian couple, to give 2 embryos to each lady. The only way those embryos can be used, it's the same as with heterosexual couples. We can only use them. They can only be used as a couple. So what are the possible destinations of those embryos? They can be donated to other patients, they can be donated to scientific research, or they can be destroyed. They cannot be used by just one of the elements of the couple.
Wonderful. Again, thank you so much indeed for yet another interesting question, Angela. And well, it looks like this was our final question. However, thank you so much for joining us tonight, because I do see that people are here just listening. So I guess you have explained everything so thoroughly that no questions are needed. But of course, I just also want to mention that, of course, if you would like to get some more details from Dr. Vladimiro, or just would like to get in touch, there will be a way for you. There is a link, of course, and there is an option. If you click on the contact button, it will be directly sent directly to Dr. Vladimir as well, right?
Okay. Well,
so
thank you.
Thank you so much. And Dr. Vladimiro, before we finish, anything else you would like to add?
No, I'm like I was saying, it's always a pleasure to be here. I'm very happy to. Well, thank you, Marianne. I'm very happy to be talking in these webinars, and sometimes patients have more specific questions that they don't want to ask publicly. So please feel free to call me directly or sending me an email, wherever. I always try to answer, sometimes not immediately, but it's always a pleasure. And once again, congratulations to you, because especially from the beginning of the pandemic, this website has been done a wonderful work. I even go here myself a lot of times when I need to study some topics. There have been wonderful speakers. Okay.
Thank you so much. That means a lot, for sure. We are proud to be able to provide this content to all of you, because we know there are like over 360 webinars so far, so plenty of topics, of course, and still there are some more of those coming up. And you have been a part of it for a few already, and I know that we will have some more with you, and it's always a pleasure to have you here. That's for sure. You know it, right? So thanks so much indeed. And as you can see, some more thank yous are coming up your way.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Mariana. Thank you, Angela. So it's always a pleasure to be here with you as well.
Thanks indeed. And of course, it has been recorded as always, so you will have a chance to watch this if you wish. And of course, you will be redirected to Dr. Vladimiro's profile on our site, where you can find the previous webinars as well. So don't hesitate. Go ahead, check it out. There were some other topics we were discussing. I'm sure it's going to be interesting for you. And as you know, we will not be back tomorrow, but we will be back on Monday. We will talk about some other topics. This time it will be acupuncture, so some other completely different topics. But if it's something that is interesting for you, come here and join us. Okay. Dr. Vladimiro, thank you so much. Have a lovely and relaxing evening until our next event then, okay?
You too. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Then.
Take care. Bye.
Thanks for listening to me. Bye-bye.